Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Katherine Stewart, a journalist whose recent work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. And she's the author of The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. And her latest book out soon is The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And she has an op-ed at the New York Times, Bill Barr Thinks America is Going to Hell. Welcome to Background Briefing, Katherine Stewart.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us, Katherine. And your book makes the case that the religious right, we shouldn't see the religious right and its political agents like Mike Pence, etc., and religious right, many analysts think it's the kind of the tail that wags the dog of the Republican Party. But your book argues that we shouldn't see it in terms of a cultural phenomenon. But the disturbing truth is that this is a political movement that seeks to gain power and to impose its vision on all of society. And America's religious nationalists aren't just fighting a culture war. They're waging a political war on the norms and institutions of American democracy. So have I got it right? Have you got, is that what?
That's absolutely right. You absolutely do. Many people interpret the actions of the Christian right in terms of those culture war issues, as you mentioned. They think, well, they just want to end abortion, or they're fighting against, in defense of what they consider the traditional family. But this really is a political movement, and they want power. They really use religion to grow their own power and as a tool for domination. And really, they also want access to public money. Their agenda is much more comprehensive than just those 2 or 3 culture war issues that are often argued over in the public square. I think we're kidding ourselves as we just look at this through a culture war framework. Now, I do think it's really helpful in understanding the movement to distinguish between the leaders of the movement and the followers. The leaders are the heads of the policy organizations, the legal advocacy groups, sort of pious preachers like Robert Jeffress, who are always seeing in the public square, or leaders like Ralph Strozinger, or folks like David Barton, who are sort of the strategists. But the rank and file, the foot soldiers of the movement, truly believe that they're fighting for things like an end to abortion. They've been these issues have been presented to them as the moral issues of our time, the issues of abortion and same-sex marriage. But over time, those leaders have reframed these cultural war issues to capture and control their votes. They understand that if you can get people to vote on 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. So they use those issues really to solidify and maintain their political power for themselves and their allies, and to protect the tax exemptions that they already have, but also to increase the flow of public money in their direction, and private money as well. And very importantly, to enact economic policies that are favorable to the big funders of the movement, the sort of DeVos's and the Green family and all of these plutocratic funders that I write about in my book.
So when you talk about abortion being an issue to kind of whip up the Christian right base and get them to vote, a lot of the Christian right have felt betrayed by the various promises that right-wing politicians have issued vis-a-vis abortion. But my sense is that now that Trump is riding high, and you saw him at the National Prayer Breakfast being cheered by all of these Christian right leaders that you just mentioned, I think he's going to go ahead. I think they are actually going to make an attempt to ban abortion. He's up in the polls, and the Democrats are floundering. I don't think this is an unreasonable prediction.
No, you're absolutely correct about that. It's not an unreasonable prediction. They've been promising to ban abortion for years, and they really mean what they say. But I think when you look at the abortion issue, it's really interesting to remember that abortion wasn't an issue until quite recently. For many years, Republicans, when Roe v. Wade was first passed, many Republicans supported the liberalization of abortion laws, believing that they accorded well with that party's tradition, support for birth control, and Protestant values. Remember, Billy Graham himself widely shared Protestant sentiments when he said in 1968, I would disagree with what he called the Catholic stance. It was seen as a Catholic issue, and he said, I believe in Planned Parenthood. Billy Graham said that. Ronald Reagan signed into law the most liberal abortion law in the country in 1967. And even when Roe v. Wade was passed, the Southern Baptist Convention bureau chief of their Baptist press wrote an announcement saying that religious liberty, human equality, and justice are advanced by the Supreme Court abortion decision. Now, that position wasn't exceptional at the time. The 1971 convention of the Southern Baptists actually endorsed the call for legalization of abortion in some instances, and they called it a middle ground between the extreme of abortion on demand and the opposite extreme of abortion as murder. If you look at even figures like Phyllis Schlafly, who eventually became a leader of the anti-abortion movement, this was not the issue that animated her early in her career. She started off with a sort of opposition to communism, and then later the issue that really motivated her was the Equal Rights Amendment. The issue of abortion became weaponized over time as a way to sort of unite disparate factions of what would become a sort of stronger political party, a way to unite conservative evangelicals and conservative Catholics. But, we have to remember that even Barry Goldwater, who was a great conservative hero, supported abortion early in his career, and his wife, Peggy, was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Can you imagine that happening today? But there's been this purity, sort of movement for purity within the Republican Party. In a way, they've constructed almost like a new religion, of a new sort of pro-life religion, where like the central tenet is in opposition to abortion, because that issue is so useful to them politically. When I was researching my book, I went to all of these gatherings for pastors. The movement organizes these pastor gatherings to sort of get everybody on the same page. They understand that pastors drive votes, and they try to communicate, the importance to these congregations through their pastors of voting, quote, biblical values. So I went to this one pastor gathering where maybe 30 or 40 pastors were in the room and being lectured by a series of speakers. And one of the speakers got up and he said, when you're speaking to your congregations, what's more important, talking about the minimum wage or talking about life? Well, when you put it that way, the pastors are sort of thinking, wow. And this was in an area where the pastors are, working with sort of in economically challenged communities. So you'd think that the issues that would matter to congregants are things like a fair minimum wage, access to education and health care, and those kinds of issues. But they're being directed specifically to communicate to their congregations that abortion is the number one issue that matters. And that's why they're quite serious about banning abortion. They will not back down.
And of course you bring up the unfortunate disparity in terms of framing and semantics. The pro-life people have a much stronger argument in that brand than pro-choice. Pro-choice almost sounds frivolous. And again, I'm speaking with Katherine Stewart, who's a journalist whose recent work has appeared at the New York Times, The Nation, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, and she's the author of The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. And her latest book out soon is The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Christian Nationalism. And she has an article at the New York Times, Bill Barr Thinks America is Going to Hell. So let's talk a little bit about Bill Barr and this compact between the Protestant religious right, which is the one that we more often than not refer to when we use that term, the religious right or the Christian right. But Bill Barr, he's not actually a member of Opus Dei. Actually, Opus Dei went to the very far right Catholic cult that believes in very, very patriarchal Catholicism, winding back the clock to 1,000 years, and certainly getting rid of the current pope who they hate. And they also believe in laissez-faire capitalism. So it's a merger of right-wing religion and laissez-faire capitalism, as far as I can tell, as I try and offer up a definition. But there's a very powerful network led by Leonard Leo, the head of the Federalists, who's putting all these reactionary and unqualified judges on the federal bench. And then you've got Pat Cipollone, the president's lawyer, who just conducted his defense in this bogus thing they call a trial in the Senate, the impeachment trial, and a whole bunch. Larry Kudlow, his economic advisor, etc. There's a whole network of these Opus Dei types. But Barr recently, believe it or not, Lev Parnas, one of these, the bag man for Giuliani and the Russian oligarchs, he said recently that Bill Barr has made Trump incredibly powerful. And I think the record is clear. When Bill Barr came along, he basically rescued Trump's floundering administration. He, along with Lindsey Graham, seem to be the only two people that Trump can listen to and take advice from, because you know how insecure he is, because he doesn't know anything. And anybody who tries to tell him something, like the generals who he fired, he gets very defensive. But he seems to be able to cooperate with these guys. So Barr now has an enormous amount of influence. And he's basically the guy that's making the trains run on time. But in your book, you point out that Mr. Barr's constitutional interpretation is that is, the interpretation of his belief in unlimited executive authority. His constitutional interpretation is simply window dressing on his commitment to religious authoritarianism. So this is a 1-2 punch, is it not? Right-wing Catholics and right-wing Protestants.
That's true. The movement that I write about includes many people who identify as evangelical. Many people call it a white evangelical movement, but it's not quite right. It excludes many evangelicals too, and there's diversity of thought within the evangelical world, and it also includes conservative representatives of other varieties of Protestant and non-Protestant religion, including Catholics. But back to Bill Barr, you're absolutely correct about his approach. The movement of religious nationalism that he represents is profoundly unconstitutional. People think that this constitutional crisis is just about Trump, but it's not. It's really about what the conservative movement has become, and Trump is just a symptom of the dysfunction. In a way, I think all of their talk about originalism is a form of gaslighting. What they believe in is not the Constitution of the American Revolution. They do not believe in a modern pluralistic democracy. Instead, they adhere to a kind of political religion that tells you that there's one best way to organize society, and it comes from some allegedly divinely revealed truth. I mean, so much for the Constitution. To back this up, I think we can look at the way that Barr has violated norms. He is, in my view, the rule of law he's exhibited contempt for Congress, for one thing. You know, his argument for the executive is supposed to be about the separation of powers, but the Constitution, quite clearly gives Congress certain powers. You know, if you believe in the Constitution, you're going to believe in those powers, which, by the way, are in Article 1. But he's basically participated in a blockade of Congress's exercise of legitimate powers by not testifying himself, by withholding information from Congress and the like. If you look at some of his writings and speeches, you can see that he sort of says that what he calls Judeo-Christian religion offers the best rules for them. This is a sort of paraphrase. I don't have the quotes in front of me. He offers the only, the best rules for society. He claims that, secularists are responsible for everything that's wicked and are out there wreaking havoc in human civilization. I mean, he just exhibits contempt over and over and over for people who are not members of his preferred faith. So he is really, his empowerment in the Trump administration is a symptom of the dysfunction that we're seeing broadly in our politics.
Right, but they're winning. That's the problem. And
that's true.
Trump is accruing more and more power. He's absolutely defiant, and he's vindictive. He wants to punish everybody. I think he wants to criminalize the opposition. In other words, criminalize the Democratic Party place them beyond the pale, which is what fascists do when they get rid of parliamentary democracy. So I think we're heading in that path. He also wants to change the libel laws, and he wants to go after all of his enemies. And he's already said the press is the enemy of the people. So I see the writing on the wall here, and these Christian soldiers are just all too happy and waiting to line up behind Trump.
That's true. I think the aspect of the Trump phenomenon that's going to have the biggest long-standing impact on our country is not, as many people say, the rise of nativism and populism among the white working classes, which people keep talking about. It's really the empowerment of this small group of religious extremists who've figured out how to turn popular discontent to their advantage. They are this nationalist, America First rhetoric can be misleading but people don't, they think, well, of course I want to support America, and we all want to support America. I mean, I want to support America too. I want a secure country, just as an affluent country as much as anyone else. But beyond this, there's a kind of anti-modern, anti-liberal ideology that they're appealing to that forms common cause with other forms of religious nationalism around the world. I mean, I think it's important to remember that all of this sort of anti-abortion, anti-LGBT rhetoric in politics is really a way of advancing right-wing nationalist projects. For those projects, you need to identify an out-group and unite the in-group around its fear and loathing of the out-group. And I went, when I was researching my book, to the World Congress of Families, which is a gathering of the so-called global conservative movement, where leaders of the sort of reactionary right in different countries sort of make common cause and state their united opposition to what they call global liberalism. And we're really seeing something afoot around the world. This is not just a phenomenon that's unique to America.
Well, you've got Franklin Graham praising Putin and other religious right leaders praising the Russians because they are religious reactionaries. Putin has given the Orthodox Church an enormous amount of power and influence, and he, of course, is personally I don't know what he's personally corrupt. He's a total kleptocratic thug, but he's using religion in the way that I think Trump is using religion. Pence, of course, is a true believer, but Trump is, I think, completely cynical. But again, I think he's being effective, and I think we literally on the cusp of a very, very ugly wake-up call here.
Yes, it's a shame that it takes this for people to wake up. I'm starting to see more hopeful signs of unity among those who oppose this kind of authoritarian movement, oppose the idea that our society should be dominated by religious nationalists and ruled not according to constitutional principles, but in accordance with their interpretation of the Bible. But I think that it's really important. One thing that they've done right, or at least effectively, is to create a positive voting culture, to not get mired in disputes about personality. I mean, if anybody who is open to criticism on their personality, it would be Trump. But I've been to Christian nationalist gatherings where speakers say this is all about judges, judges, judges. They really understand that their agenda is going to be pushed through the courts, and therefore they set aside their distaste, perhaps, for some of the personalities involved to unite in service of overtaking the courts. And that's how they justify their leaders, their support for a leader like Trump. So I'm starting to see this kind of interest in the bigger issues on the part of those who oppose the movement and wish to sort of restore our norms and would like to see America respect this as a country that respects constitutional principles and the dignity of our pluralistic
foundation. Right. And again, I'm speaking with Katherine Stewart, who is the author of the brand new book, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And your book, Katherine, explodes the myth that the religious right keeps pounding away at, that we're a Judeo-Christian nation. The founding fathers founded this country on Judeo-Christian principles, and it's absolutely dead wrong. The founding fathers came out of a historical period of religious wars, religious bigotry. If you go back to the intellectual sort of spark, if you will, of the American Revolution, Tom Paine was an atheist. And Tom Paine, among the many wise things that he said was, and this harkens back to America's founding on Plymouth Rock with the witch burners and all of that, that horrible, I guess it's a part of our political DNA, but it's a pretty ugly part of our political DNA. Belief in a cruel God makes a cruel man. And that's what I see in this. I know there's this popular series, The Handmaid's Tale, on television. But how much do you see this as having this kind of sense of patriarchal cruelty?
I think you're absolutely correct that there is patriarchal cruelty baked in, and the movement is rooted in the idea that of hierarchies, that our country should be dominated by Christians with the right ideology. The hierarchies are based in gender. At times they're based in race. Certainly, many of the followers of the movement believe that the movement is sort of implicitly white rather than implicitly white. They sort of seem to harken back to an imagined past where our nation was once supposedly Christian and white. But, I think the most salient impediment to our understanding of the movement is the notion that Christian nationalism is a conservative ideology. The correct word here is radical. A genuinely conservative movement would want to seek to preserve institutions of value that have been crafted over centuries of American history. It would prize the integrity of electoral politics, legitimacy of the judiciary, the idea of human rights, which you alluded to, the importance of public education. But this movement, even while it pretends to be reviving traditional values, is really contradicting the long-established principles and norms of our democracy.
Well, the people that are fighting back, of course, are people like the Reverend Barber, who talks about this Christian fundamentalism, particularly in the red states and in the South. They've hijacked Christianity, or it was a slaveholder religion. And basically, he's arguing that the Bible is the one and only form of mass media that has proclaimed justice and righteousness for all who are oppressed. And we have to engage in this battle for the Bible. And that's what I find astounding in this country, that the right wing have captured the high ground on patriotism. John Wayne and Ronald Reagan, they were all the patriots, particularly in the movies. And then, but they've also confiscated the Bible. But the Bible is a historical document. And if you look at the history of the prophet Jesus, he was anything. He would have been on the religious left, for God's sake. He didn't believe in having to carry an assault rifle and hate homosexuals and shake down poor people for money. He was the opposite. He took care of the poor.
That's absolutely true. I think if you look at during the Civil War, there was a battle for the Bible back then. We have to remember that most of the pro-slavery theologians, and there were a lot of them, they too, as Christian nationalists today, were emphasizing the divine origins of the existing order, which invariably involved domination and subordination, always of men over women, and often of white people over black people too. I mean, there were pro-slavery theologians such as Robert Louis Dabney, James Thornwell, who were trying to prove, as one writer said, proving from the Bible that in the relation of master and slave there was no sin whatsoever. And I think, contrary to popular belief, a lot of theologians of the North kind of went along with the program. To give just one example, the founder of Yale Divinity School and agreed with this. There were, I think, the leading Presbyterian theologian at Princeton concurred. It was the identification of religious authority with perpetuation of the institution of slavery. At a deep level, it was part of a counter-revolutionary response to the perceived liberal and irreligious excesses that were associated with the American Revolution. And there were many anti-slavery theologians as well. Many of them challenged this idea of the divine origins of the existing order and promoted human rights. But, Frederick Douglass at the time observed that these religious abolitionists tended to be disempowered minorities in their own denominations. He looked back and he said that, a few heterodox and still fewer Orthodox ministers were almost to a man were living in humble pulpits, but it was the wealthy theologians. He called them the $5,000 divines. $5,000 back then was a lot of money. He said they were almost to a man on the side of slavery.
Right.
So there's always been this tension between a sort of more authoritarian, literalist interpretation of the Bible that relies on subordination and domination, that promotes the values of absolute literalism, which is the kind of interpretation of the Bible we're seeing in Christian nationalism today, and a different kind of reading of the Bible that emphasizes care for the poor, dignity of all humans, and equality. And that's what religious progressives are speaking to. Now, I think it's important to say that, most important progressive evangelicals are opposed to the politics of division and conquest that Trump is promoting, but they're not the ones who've seized the reins of political power Trump supporting Christian nationalists have.
And again, I'm speaking with Katherine Stewart, the author of the brand new book out soon, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda of the success of this political movement known as the Christian right, which we often confuse it as a cultural movement, but it is thoroughly political. And Christian nationalism, as you write, is the fruit of a long-standing anti-democratic reactionary strain in American thought that draws on some of the most troubling episodes in America's past. I talked about the burning of the witches and Plymouth Rock and all of that horrible strand of cruel paternal religion, which hardly, I don't know how you can even use the word in that context, but its modern iteration. You've got, I mentioned all of the Opus Dei people that are in the Trump administration, and particularly in the courts. I mean, they've got 4 or 5 people on the Supreme Court, for God's sake, Opus Dei. So it's an extraordinarily successful movement in terms of, and Bill Barr is definitely, the spear carrier, and he couldn't be in a stronger position. But, you got people like Ted Cruz his father is a preacher who's a dominionist. So tell us a little bit about the dominionists. I mean, are they the epitome of Christian nationalism?
They are the epitome of Christian nationalism. It's very interesting. I'll just give you one example. This fellow, Lance Wallnau, who wrote a book about Trump, and he's very intimately connected with David Barton, who's the Christian nationalist sort of leading pseudo-historian. So he believes that true Christians should seek to control what he calls the 7 mountains of culture, or 7 areas of human civilization that includes government, business, media, education, arts and education, and entertainment, family and religion. He casts himself as a prophet, as a prophetic leader. And he's apparently said that the Trump Hotel, for instance, has angelic activity at a different level than other locales. He's part of a religious movement that believes they can hear direct messages from God. They claim to have influence in the supernatural realm. They offer prophecies about the future, and they engage in something called spiritual warfare. This is a religious movement that I think in an earlier time would have been seen as very much on the fringes of political power. But, Wallnau was actually given a featured speaking slot when I went to the Values Voters Summit in 2018. This is an annual gathering of some of the leading activists of the religious right. As I mentioned, he's also very closely associated with David Barton, who is this broadly influential purveyor of Christian nationalist mythical history. Now, Wallnow is incredibly political, as a lot of these Dominionists are. He wrote a book in 2016 comparing Trump to King Cyrus. And he said that Trump was going to restore the crumbling walls that separate us from cultural collapse. So this is not only a movement that has its own beliefs, people are entitled to their beliefs, and that's great, but they're unabashedly political, and they use their politics to try to shore up support for their favorite political candidates.
Well, just in the last couple of minutes, what would your suggestion to our audience be, Katherine, the need for your book? I think that we are heading into a very dangerous period. We have a proto-fascist in the White House who's an ignorant thug, a small man with a lot of power. You never give power. A psychiatrist recently made this point. You'd never give power to people that are pathologically narcissistic. They're the most dangerous people. The idea that this man, this unbridled narcissist, has the power to destroy the world is just beyond belief. But his handmaidens are the religious right and Mike Pence and the DeVosses and this whole cadre of people. And as we talked about earlier, they will ban abortion if they can, and they will make a hell of a try. So in the meantime, our progressive audience that we're trying to get them to buy your book here today, what would your invocation be to them? Because I think we are in the most dangerous moment in our history, that certainly in my lifetime, and we can't take this. This is not what this country is about. It's not what it was founded upon, and its very fate, the fate of American democracy, is at stake here.
That's true. I think voting matters. And I think it's really important when it comes to elections to not just get out the vote, but to try to engage other potential voters. I think it's important to look beyond issues of personality and perceived imperfections to the larger issues. Who is this person going to appoint to cabinet, lead cabinet? Who are they going to appoint to the courts? And sort of keep those larger factors in mind. And finally, I think the more you know about the movements, the better equipped you will be to fight back. And that's why I wrote my book. It's why I detailed all of the different ways that the religious right and the Christian nationalist movement is gaining power, including, legislative agenda and their legal agenda and all these other areas. And I think the more we can educate ourselves about it, the better off we'll be.
Well, Katherine Stewart, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you've been listening to Katherine Stewart, who's a journalist whose recent work has appeared at the New York Times, The Nation, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, and she's the author of The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. And her latest book out soon is The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Christian Nationalism. And she has an article at the New York Times, Bill Barr Thinks America is Going to Hell. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon.